My name's Bob Darrell, and I am alcoholic. Quickly, I'm going to just kind of shoot through fear and sex, or even... No, not fear of sex, fear and sex. The next thing that in this unblocking the channel that it asks us to do is to look at and ultimately surrender by trusting God these fears that have driven some of us. And I was 4.5 to 5 years sober before I'm doing my first real inventory out of the book. I'd done 2 other ones, the 30-some questions out of the 12 by 12 and the life story one. But I'm doing this real inventory for the first time out of the book, and I finished the resentment section to the best of my ability, did pretty well with that. And I get to fears, and I remember like it was yesterday, I'm sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad, and I got fears written over the top of the page. And I'm sitting there, and I'm drawing a blank. I can't think of anything I'm afraid of. And I knew that when I got sober, I was afraid of being homeless. I was afraid of doing 2 years in prison. I was afraid of a lot of stuff. Some people wanted to beat me up and things like that. But I'm sober now almost 5 years, and I don't feel like I have any fears. And I thought, well, maybe AA works. Maybe I'm praying and stuff, and maybe that old adage you hear in AA, if you pray, don't worry, maybe that's what's happened to me. So I went to this, in Vegas we have this end of the month speaker meeting where we bring in an out-of-town speaker, and I went to this meeting, and there's a guy speaking. He said a couple things that got my attention about the steps, and I went up to talk to him after the meeting. I said, I'm doing a 4-step, and I told him a little bit about what I was discovering in resentments, etc. And I said, I'm doing the fear thing, and I get to fears, and I don't think I have any fears. And he said, really? And I said, yeah, I don't really think I have any fears. He said, do you mind if I'd ask you a few questions? I said, no, sure, well, go ahead. He said, are you afraid of large, angry, barking dogs? Well, but everybody is. We're not talking about everybody. We're talking about you. Are you afraid of large, angry, dark, barking dogs? Well, yeah. He said, well, good. You can put that down. Are you afraid of rattlesnakes? Well, everybody's afraid of rattlesnakes. No, but we're not talking about everybody. We're talking about you. Are you afraid of rattlesnakes? Well, yeah. He says, good. You can put that down. Are you afraid of black widow spider? Yeah. Are you afraid of being embarrassed? Yeah. Are you afraid of what people think of you? Oh, continually. Are you afraid of growing old alone? Are you afraid that no one will ever love you? Are you afraid you'll never be a success? Are you afraid if you were, people would expect things of you couldn't do, maintain? Are you afraid of things from your past catching up with you? Are you afraid of some of your creditors you'll never be able to pay them off? Are you afraid of not getting out of debt? Are you afraid of cancer? I had cancer every 3 days. I mean, it's just, oh man, I can't tell you how many just fabulously humble deathbed speeches I've rehearsed in my head in my first couple of years of sobriety. Bring tears to your eyes. Are you afraid of homosexuality? And I was in county jails. I'd constantly terrorized about that. Are you afraid of getting sick and not being able to take care of yourself? And he said, are you afraid of people finding out secrets about your past and judging you for it? Are you afraid God doesn't really love you? And he just went on. He finally said, so is there anything you're not afraid of? And I said, how did that happen? In the book on page 68, it talks about the answer, and it's a hard answer. Because this is an action program. And I don't like to... I'm not an action kind of guy. I'm a thinker. There's no chapter in the book into thinking. It's into action. And it says here that he says, what's the answer here? It says, well, perhaps there's a better way. We think so, for we're now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. And aren't all my fears really judgments? Judgments of what I think's life's going to happen. There's an interesting line here in the book. It says, did not these fears set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve, but did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? And I'll tell you what that means in my experience is that I get these judgments about life, these things I'm afraid are going to happen, and I believe the fear so strongly that it alters my attitude. And if you've ever been a pilot or know any pilots, attitude is your angle of approach. When you're coming to land a plane, if you have the wrong attitude, you're going to end up in a parking lot somewhere. And so what happens is in these, the psychologists call this self-fulfilling prophecies. I get a fear, like I did in early sobriety, my first sober relationship. I mean, I have no real self-respect or self-esteem, and I get into a relationship and I'm terrorized on some subconscious level that this girl's going to dump me for somebody who has more going on. I'm afraid she's going to abandon me and reject me. So what happens? So the fear changes my angle of approach to her, and I become the crazy guy that's driving by her house in the middle of the night looking to see if any guys' cars are there. It drove me to become the possessive, scared guy that every time she hugs somebody in the meeting, hey, hey, hey. She leaves the room, I look through her purse looking for guys' business cards, right? She said to me, yeah, right. She said, yeah, I know. She said, hey, listen, when I'm out of line, I don't like me either. Let me tell you. We all get on the same page about Bob, let me tell you. She said to me one time, she says, you're always looking at me. She says, I feel like you're smothering me. And what happened is I made that fear come true. I became the guy that literally drove her out of my life. And as she's leaving and I'm devastated and I want to go out in the garden and eat worms, there's a little voice in the back of my head that says, see, you were right. I like being right. My ego doesn't care if I'm dead. It just cares about being right. It doesn't care about anything else. It makes a judgment, and it's going to be right if it kills me about that judgment. Do you ever notice how you have a perception and a judgment about somebody, and then the evidence comes in overwhelmingly that you're wrong? Yeah, but I think he's really like that. I'm the guy that stands before a judge and says, guilty, Your Honor, but with an explanation. Yeah. So, the book says that these fears ought to be classed with stealing. They seem to do more harm. And I sat years ago with an old-timer, sober a long time. He's dying of natural causes. And he said something to me I'll never forget. He said, when you get to the home stretch, he said, and you look back over your life, it's not the mistakes you regret. It's the people that I was afraid to love and the things I was afraid to try. And fear will rob you of your very life. God will throw opportunities for love and abundance at you like the flow of a river. And my fear just goes like, throws it away, pushes it out. Nah, that wouldn't work. I wouldn't like that. Nah, they're an idiot. Do you ever, I don't know what, I dislike at depth people I don't even know. Where does that come from? Where does that come from? It comes from the great I am. The thing I got to get my life out of, it's not so much I have to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. I got to get it out of the hands of this idiot. Right? That's really what this is about. It's if nothing else, if you can get your hands off of your life, you will stop hurting yourself. So the answer, it says, is trust. And I have a hard time with that, and I don't really know what trust is. And I go to a retreat, and the guy, this retreat, we're sitting talking between the sessions, and I tell him, I said, I get a lot of anxiety. I worry a lot. I'm in my head a lot. And he said, well, do you believe in God? And I said, yeah, I believe in God. I'm sober longer than I've ever been my whole life. I know I didn't do that. That's God. He says, you pray? I said, I pray every single morning and every night. I do not miss. And I still don't to this day. He said, well, you have a lot of faith and you pray a lot. He says, but guys like us, we can have all the faith in the world and pray constantly and still die of alcoholism. He said, faith isn't enough. He said, you have to have trust. He says, I'll tell you what the difference is. He said, if you went to a circus and you sat in the audience and you watched a tight wire act and you watched a guy come out to the edge of the platform pushing a wheelbarrow, you could sit in that audience and have all the faith in the world. He's a professional. I know he can cross that tight wire pushing that wheelbarrow. I bet she's done 1,000 times. Absolute faith he can do it. But if you had trust, you'd go up and get in the wheelbarrow. And I thought, whoa, wait a minute. I don't want to get in the wheelbarrow. I want to read about getting in the wheelbarrow. I want to talk about and discuss getting in the wheelbarrow. I'd like to philosophize about getting in the wheelbarrow. I just don't want to get in the wheelbarrow because I'm afraid. I don't trust God. That's the bottom reality. Why I worry so much in my head is I don't trust God. See, I'm afraid we're going to get about halfway out that wire and I'm going to hear this voice that's going to go, is that Bob? Is that little guy plays with himself? Bob, you know? Well, I mean, I have a tremendous sense of unworthiness when it comes to God. But what happens to guys like me? Page 53, it says that we will become crushed by self-imposed crises we cannot postpone or evade. And we will have to fearlessly face the proposition. God is either everything or he's nothing. He either is or he is. Bob, what's your choice going to be? And many times in my sobriety, it's really come right down to that. I'm so scared and so terrorized over a situation that I absolutely can't control or change. And I've been forced to get in that wheelbarrow. And what happens is I get to the other side and it's good. It's all right. I've been safe and protected. And I don't know how many dozens of times a guy like me has to do that before I start to get it that the wheelbarrow is a safe place. It's really a lot safer than the audience. I don't know how. I was talking to Dave at dinner last night about how, like, I'm flying into a hurricane. People are calling me all the time, oh, you're worried about that? No. I trust God. It's not that I'm not afraid of things anymore. I still get fear, don't get me wrong, but it does not affect my actions. And the whole deal about getting in the wheelbarrow, it's not to be free from fear and anxiety. It's to act like someone who is. And then what happens is if you act this, I am absolutely convinced of this. I've spent a lot of my life believing that things were going to turn to crap, and it affected my angle of approach, and what happens is life is crap. And I get to be right about that. And if I believe and trust in God and I act accordingly, and my angle of approach towards my life is that of someone who I'm acting like someone who is in God's hands, you know what happens is I get to be right about that too. I get to with God's power, we get to recreate our lives. But I am not the deal. It is the power that works in my life that makes that happen. And I trust in God more than I ever have. More today than I would have believed possible at 20 years sober or 15 years sober. Now, I am almost afraid to say that because I'm thinking, next week something awful's going. I'm going to be a basket kid. I hate to even say that, but right now at this moment, that is my experience, and that may undo itself because stuff undoes itself. Surrender undoes itself. The propensity of the alcoholic ego to reassert it. I mean, it comes back like a bad tumor. It just reasserts itself in your life. But right here, right now, today, I'm not worried about this hurricane. I'm not worried about nothing. I know God's going to take care of me. I hope I demonstrate that, especially to the guys I sponsor, because if I'm going to ask them to trust in God, then I want to be an example of a guy who's trying to do that. I want to be an example of a guy. When they look at me, I want them to see a guy. I want to encourage them to get in the wheelbarrow, and for me to encourage them to get in the wheelbarrow, I got to be trying to keep in that wheelbarrow, because that's the way Alcoholics Anonymous works. We're the primary examples of how to do recovery of the people we sponsor. I think I was sober probably 17 years before I awoke to that my behavior was no longer just about me, that I had a responsibility here. I don't know. I didn't sign up for it. I didn't want to be an old timer in AA. I just didn't want to die of alcoholism. But you stay active in Alcoholics Anonymous and you sponsor people, not because you're wonderful, but because that is absolutely the only thing I can do to survive this disease. And as a result of that, I end up placed in a position where there are guys, new guys in our group, and some of the guys I sponsor, whether I want the position or not, they're looking to me and my actions as the primary example of how to conduct themselves sober. My actions are my vote for them on how they ought to conduct themselves in AA and in their life. I'll tell you something, when you wake up to that, I started finding myself ashamed of some behavior that I probably could have went on for years doing. And I got brought to the table in step 6 with some stuff just because I think sometimes we're brought to the table in step 6 through pain and sometimes through love. And I started coming to the table in step 6 on some of this stuff because I loved you. Didn't come here wanting that. That was not on my agenda. If you'd have had me make a list of things I wanted to see in my life in 10, 15, 20 years, loving people would have not been on the list. Being loved would have been on the list. But not loving people. So, that's the answer to the fear problem, is to trust God. Now, about sex. You know, isn't it funny? The inventory of sex is not about sex. It's about hurting God's kids. It's about harm. It's about selfishness. It's about dishonesty. It's about how these inherent defects of character, which are part of who I am, are exasperated by sexual energy. How I have a greater propensity when it comes to relationships to be almost delusionally dishonest. When it comes to relationships to be I don't even know it's not that I'm lying. I'm presenting a creative, upgraded version of Bob. This is the Bob on steroids on a good day, Bob, right? The Bob that I'm not really that guy. I'm that guy on a very, very good day, but I'm not really that guy. I sponsor a lot of guys. They call me up, usually after they're in a relationship about 6-8 months, and they go, oh, she's changed. No, she just couldn't maintain the wonderful all the time facade anymore. And she's saying to her sponsor, he's changed. He doesn't hold the door for me anymore. He doesn't bring me flowers anymore. Well, that was never him to begin with. That was him coming from behind, being something he's not because he believes the lie that as is, nobody's going to love him. That's him. That's not the real him. We have a great propensity for dishonesty. And as a result, in this sexual inventory, I'm not really looking, it's not about sex. Matter of fact, the book is very clear. We're not to be the arbitrator of anyone's sex conduct. It's about hurting God's kids. And I'll tell you something I believe from my experience, and I know this painfully true. If I hurt one of God's kids, I can't do that without hurting myself. I can't. There's an old American Indian proverb, a story about this earthworm who's a big, like an alpha earthworm that staked out this piece of grass, this piece of ground that is very nutrient-rich soil, and it's his territory. And he just burrows through this ground, patrolling, make sure no other worms are in there eating his stuff, and he's very territorial. And one day he's burying through there, and he comes across another earthworm. And he starts jockeying, in the aggressive stance. And next thing they know, he attacks his other earthworm to find out he's attacked his own tail. Right? And you see, when I hurt you, I have never hurt another person on this planet without paying a price for it, without somehow attacking myself. Because I think in the realm of the spirit, the thing that the book talks about, I think when we enter into the realm of the spirit, I start to get that I am you. And so we're looking to, because it's the harm creates the separation. And that's why the amends process is so very, very vital and important. It's in the amends process that I start to really undo the separation by my actions. Page 76 is the section on step 6 and 7. I'm not going to really get into step 5 because it's self-explanatory. It's just, you just do it. You know, you just do it. And the book basically says, if you don't do it, you'll drink again. It says you probably won't stay sober. First reason, best reason first for doing that step. You probably won't drink again. And it goes on to talk about why, because we're people who have a tendency to live the double life. And, you know, I'm the person that loves everybody on the outside and judges everybody on the inside. You know, I'm that guy. So it brings us to step 6. And on the top of page 76, it says, we have emphasized willingness as being indispensable. Are we now ready to let God remove from us all the things which we have admitted objectionable? Can he now take them all, every one? The selfishness, the dishonesty, the resentment, the fear, all the different manifestations, as it says in the book, we're driven by 100 forms of that stuff. Am I ready to have God take them all, every one? It says, if we still cling to something we will not let go, we ask God to help us be willing. Thankfully, there's nothing in Alcoholics Anonymous I am asked to do that I can't do. Nothing. I think from the moment I take the third step, my life breaks into my business and God's business through every step. And in step 6, it's my business to ask for the willingness of something I can't let go. It's my business, and it's God's business to provide the willingness. If I get to step 6, and there's a couple defects of character which I had that I know intellectually I really should give this up. But the truth is, I can't imagine life without it, really. Really. What if I really seriously asked God to remove my anger and he did? Then who would stand up for me when I'm threatened? I secretly believe life would run me over if I didn't stand up for me. If I asked God to remove my lust, and he did, oh my God. I mean, is that something Viagra would overcome? I mean, what do you do? I mean, just watch a lot of TV. Part of the problem with me is not only the fear, but every defect of character has 2 parts. And Bill talks about this in his story. In his story in the beginning of the book, he goes through a thumbnail sketch of the steps, and he says something there that is different than anywhere else in AA literature when he talks about step 6 and 7. He asks God to remove these things, and he says root and branch, as if there's 2 parts to every defect of character. And that has really been my experience. There's the branch, the thing that's poking in the eye, and what that is the consequences of the defect. But then there's the root, and in the root is the illusion of value, is this illusion of security, the illusion of validation. I mean, everybody I know wants to be free of the sleeplessness and that feeling in the pit of your stomach that you get from a deep-seated resentment you can't let go of, that you just churn about. We all want to be free of that. But are we willing to give up the pleasure of judgment? And you can't separate one from the other. That's like saying to God, God, take away my hangovers, but let me drink. I mean, it's a package here. It's a package. And so what I discovered in step 6 is I'm a hypocrite. I go to God. I'm not asking him to remove the defect. I'm asking him to remove the consequences. Really. And what is the defect? I think my defects of character are defense mechanisms that I have developed over the years that at one time worked a little bit. And then I beat them to death and they don't work anymore. Just like alcohol at one time worked very well. And then I beat it to death until it was killing me. And just my character defects and my deal with alcohol and AA were very similar. I couldn't come to you and really get into AA as long as I secretly had the illusion that I could control and enjoy my drinking. As long as I secretly, subconsciously believed there was still value in the bag and the bottle, I wasn't really ready for you, and I had a back door out of Alcoholics Anonymous. But once I got to that point where I knew that I had wrung all the fun out of it and it's killing me and I can't stop, then it was very simple for me to come to you. And the same thing is true for a lot of my character defects. I don't become entirely ready as much as I wear them out. I mean, I just wear them out until they're a broken, smoldering carcass laying in the road. Then I'm trying to kick them and get them to ride again, you know. Because it worked at one time. And without him, I'm scared. And I'm scared why? Because I don't trust God. I don't want God to take away my anger because who would protect me? Maybe he would. I don't want God to take away my lust and my greed and my all that other stuff because what would I do to fill my vacancies? Maybe God would and helping his kids would fill them. Am I really ready to turn all of this over? Really? And I think that the story of step 6 is really the story of our recovery. My sponsor has a great analogy. He says you come to Alcoholics Anonymous, it's like throwing the towel in, and then he said you get just enough self-esteem to be dangerous and you sneak the towel back, you'll spend the rest of your sobriety tearing off little bits of it and throwing it in the IRS and the kids and the family and the job, and spend the rest of the life surrendering little bits and pieces of it. And I think that's pretty much true for me. And this prayer, this 7-step prayer, is such a remarkable prayer. I think that if the old adage is true, that making a decision in step 3 is like 3 frogs sitting on a log. One makes a decision to jump in the water. How many are still on the log? And the answer is 3 because he only made the decision. I think if you really do step 6 and 7, you hear the splash. That's the splash. When I really can abandon myself of the defective defense mechanisms that I have used futilely to shore my life up and try to make me valid and whole. And the reason is that I'm a victim of this delusion that I can wrest happiness and satisfaction out of this world by managing well. And isn't that funny that we all come from that place of just obsessively trying to make our life right? And I don't know a group of people on the planet that have ever spent more money, more time, more obsessive energy in trying to make themselves happy as we have. And the end result is most of us wish we were dead. I mean, can you connect those dots? I mean, right, we're talking about absolute surrender in sobriety. The second and greatest surrender is in step 7. Surrender has a bad rap in our society, but I'll tell you something. You look at surrender historically, it's a good deal. One of the most fear-wrought surrenders probably in history occurred in the Pacific in the mid-1940s when the Japanese Empire was forced to surrender unconditionally the United States of America. And the only reason they had no alternative. A, they were alcoholic and could not manage their own lives. B, human power could relieve their alcoholism. C, the United States could and would if they were sought. They had no choice. There have been 2 atomic bombs set off at 2 of their industrial centers, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had no atomic weapons. They had no way to defend themselves again. They were screwed. And I can't imagine a more fear-wrought surrender, because they had to surrender to us in the face of the knowledge of what we did at Pearl Harbor, what we did at the prisoner of war camps in the Pacific, all the men, women, and children and soldiers that they'd killed. Imagine the terror in that. It was so bad that I know a guy in AA that was in the young kid in the Army at that time, and he was stationed in Japan after the surrender. He said one of the major jobs of our armed services over there was cleaning up the suicides. They had massive suicides in Japan of people who couldn't live with that loss of face. Massive. But in the Pacific Fleet in the mid-1940s, in effectiveness, I guess, they took their formal terms of surrender. They signed the documents. That was their third step. But that was not the end. They were required to do an open inventory of all their defenses, their planes, their boats, their ships, their guns. An honest, open inventory. And then turn those defenses over to the thing they suspected was their enemy. And I'll tell you something, as far as I know, the Japanese have never reneged on that position. They have held up to that. And it's like all surrendered entities on this planet, they found themselves, as a result of the surrender, living a life of service. And they lost self, their work ethic, their community ethic became something that was amazing. And within 40 years, as a result of surrender and service, the Japanese owned more of this country than they could have ever conquered or maintained through military means. More than they ever could have conquered. And I was over there at an AA conference about 17 years ago, and I saw the beginning of their demise. The new generation was coming up, and they didn't have the surrendered, humble service ethic. And every kid you saw under the age of 30 had shirts on with American sayings on it. They all had boom boxes, listened to American music. There's some of the greatest restaurants in the world are in Japan. I mean, food is an art. But there was one restaurant you couldn't get into. It had a line 2 blocks long. It was McDonald's. I saw that and I thought, that's the end. Put a fork in them. They're done. I mean, they're done. And what happens is their economy and their very lifestyle started to deteriorate as self started to reinsert itself into their culture. And in the world of the spirit, what's true for a business or a family or an individual must be true for everything across the board. When the spirit gets sick, everything else follows along. And the Japanese have had a tough time the last few years financially. They were the number one world power economically years ago. They were on top of the food chain. They're not anymore. But I think, and I'm sure sociologists would argue with this, or anthropologists, but my belief is the spirit of their culture got sick and they started to deteriorate. And I don't know. I saw rampant alcoholism over there when I was there. It was a way of life. It was a way of life. So this is really the formal terms of surrender. This 7-step prayer is wonderful. When it says, my Creator. So I'm addressing the person, the thing that made me, that knows more about me than I do. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. For some of us, that's a novel idea. I think secretly a lot of us think that we can't bring ourselves to the table with God until we clean our act up first. And that is a deadly, deadly prejudice. This idea that I must merit God's help. The secret prejudice that God will only really be there for me when I'm good. That he couldn't possibly help me or love me when I've done something so despicable I can't stand myself. And the reason that is a deadly prejudice is that the times I will need God the most are the times I want to go out in the garden and eat worms. And I better have a God that's there for me under all conditions, good and bad. I need to be able to give myself to God, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Amen. We have now completed step 7. What a tremendous concept. I wouldn't have wrote this. I can't imagine any. I'm amazed Bill Wilson wrote this. This had to be divinely inspired. No self-respecting alcoholic would say that. Take away every single defect of character that stands in my way of my usefulness. No, take away every single defect of character that stands in the way of everyone realizing what a tremendous fellow Bob is. Or every single defect of character that stands in the way of being rich and famous or having the perfect relationship or at very least, I would have said, be happy. Don't I get happy? No. It says that stands in the way of my usefulness. And I'll tell you something. I've known a lot of different things in life. There's not a feeling better. There's not a feeling that makes me feel more complete, more connected to this life than the feeling of usefulness. In our 9th step promises, it says that one of the promises is that feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. When you're useful, you're not feeling sorry for yourself. That's why almost invariably, I get guys that come to me, and I'm not talking about people with legitimate mental health cases, but I'm talking about people who get sober, they go to meetings, they're not sponsoring anybody, they haven't worked the steps, and they're depressed. You're supposed to be depressed if you're doing that. I mean, really. I mean, if you get physically sober and you're coming to meetings and you're not sponsoring anybody or doing any 12-step work and you're not working the steps and you're not depressed, you're an Al-Anon. I mean, really? I mean, it's one of the symptoms of untreated alcoholism. Read page 52. It's a part of the deal. And they invariably want to take some kind of medication. I said, well, look, let's try something. Let's try, give me 6 months, give me a year if you can of your life, and we're going to work these steps, and we're going to throw yourself into helping other alcoholics. And if you still need the medication after that year or 6 months or whatever you'll give me of doing that, then maybe you should really have some. But give me that time. Give AA that shot and I'm not talking about just going to some meetings and scratching down on the back of a matchbook a few defects. I'm talking about doing this. Because what you're really saying, if you haven't done that, is you're saying AA doesn't work. And you're saying that without really, as it says in chapter 5, completely giving yourself to this simple program. I mean, if you come here and you just dabble around with a little crap and you don't get what everybody else gets, you're not supposed to. Till you completely give yourself to this simple program. That's the line of demarcation right through the fellowship of the people who recover, I mean in here, and the people who don't. It says those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program. And I tell you, without exception, every guy, I've had dozens of guys come to me like that, without exception. Everyone who has worked the steps, who have cleaned the things out of their life that interfered with their relationship with God and their ability to be effective and understanding of other people and useful. Without exception, I've never had someone that ended up needing medication after doing that. Never had one. Now, there are people in Alcoholics Anonymous that have legitimate mental health problems. That's a different, schizophrenia, and I know people that's different. But I'm talking about the symptoms of untreated alcoholism. I don't think it's possible to immerse yourself in this work and feel depressed. You know, when you read the story of Bill Wilson, one of the worst and best, it was a double-edged sword in Bill Wilson's life, is when they ended up with stepping stones. You know, and Bill, I understand, I could put myself in Bill's place completely. Now, he's been being supported by Lois. She's never had her own house. She's staying at a house that's owned by her relatives. I mean, it's, you know, if you're a guy like me, that feels bad. And now they have a chance for this beautiful house. I've been there a half dozen times out in the upstate New York. It's really pretty. It's out in the middle of the woods. And back in those days, it was very secluded. It was way out in the middle of nowhere. And Bill wanted Lois to have that house, and they moved out there. And all of a sudden, a guy who's spending every day of his life in the trenches at the Calvary Mission and on Skid Row and to the early meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, a guy who was, as he talks about on page 20 of the book, where he says, our very lives as ex-problem drinkers depend upon our constant thought of others, their needs, and how we can work for them. He went from that to being a figurehead way out in the middle of nowhere, that it was a half-a-day trek to get back to where the newcomers were. And I can imagine myself in the middle of a beautiful house, what appearingly would be paradise, finding a little piece of hell within myself, because I would be cut off from my primary purpose. I can see myself getting depressed. Like I had a fantasy years ago. I had to end up with a lot of money and doing well financially. I was going to buy this huge house on the beach in Hana, which is the backside of Maui. And it was paradise. It was gorgeous. It was beautiful. I'd have died there. I'm telling you, I'd have died in the middle of the most beautiful place on the planet. I would have died. Because I would have cut myself off from my purpose for being alive. I would have died in the middle of paradise. Bill said in his story something that was very prophetic. He said it in late 1938 when he wrote, or 39, I guess, or early 39 when he wrote his story. Something that he hadn't experienced yet, but he said in his story that unless the alcoholic can expand his spiritual life through self-sacrifice and constant work with others, he will never survive the certain, meaning they're coming, trials and low spots ahead. Bill hadn't even had his yet. And when he moved away from New York City and he all of a sudden was no longer expanding his spiritual life by being in the trenches. That's why guys like me and a lot of the people I hang out with, we just constantly showing up looking for the new guys, constantly fishing. I still go on 12-step calls. I answer the phones for central office. I go to hospitals and institutions. Basically, if I'm serious, really serious about being in the wheelbarrow, if I'm really serious about carrying out that decision in step 3, then I must set aside all my judgment of what is ever presented to me. And when AA says, come and do this, I just say yes. There's no, it's service without judgment. I think it's a dangerous stance for me to say, well, I'm not going to go to that conference. They don't really reimburse me enough. Or I'm not going to go down that detox. Those people don't really, they're too poor. Or I'm not going to go over there. I don't think I'd help. If Alcoholics Anonymous, if I am serious about the decision in step 3, then when AA asks me to do something, there's only one answer. It's yes. If I can do it. Now, if I have another commitment or something else with my family or my daughter or something, that's a whole different story. But whenever there's an opening and an opportunity to say yes, it's my job to say yes. But the hard problem, if you're like me, the great cry of the alcoholic is, well, that's fine. But what about me? What about me? And, I'll try a little experiment. If you're sober a little while and you're a little down, a little blue, and you're not working with any newcomers, and you're not, try a little experiment. And maybe you're starting to suspect you need to see a psychiatrist. Maybe you really need to get into yourself a little more. I'll tell you, try an experiment. Spend the next month just working on you. Spend the next month doing for you, analyzing you, trying to make you better. If you survive that month, take a month and devote it solely to trying to help God's kids. You live and breathe service. That's all you're about for that month. And I'll tell you, if you have the same malady of the Spirit that I have, at the end of that second month, it'll be as clear as anything you've ever seen that this is the answer. There's something about me that I have an absolute inability to enhance my own life by working on me. And yet, my life is really good today. It's not perfect. Actually, it is perfect, but let me think about it for a couple minutes. And it is great, and it's in direct relationship to how much I walk away from my life and help other people. I think that that's the deal here. I think that's my purpose. I think the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are designed to allow me to carry out the decision that I must desperately need to make in step 3, so I can get my life out of the hands of an idiot. And as a result, I get closer to you. The book says a promise. It says God will show you how to create the fellowship you crave. And isn't it odd behind the bluster how we all say, I don't need anybody. And most of us feel like we're dying of loneliness. That in this purpose, of this primary purpose of helping people that are like me, I find the way to create the fellowship I crave. And I always have craved fellowship. I have never felt more connected to God as when I'm connected to you. The closest I've ever felt to God in my whole life is usually when I'm, after listening to a 5th step, or after spending 3 or 4 hours with a guy who's wanting to kill himself. Because that's when I feel the sense of usefulness, and that's when God's presence is the most concrete and real in my life. There's an old poem that was in the grapevine years ago. I hate people that read poetry in AA meetings. I really do. But it's a great poem. And it was in the grapevine, and I'm going to risk being a guy I don't like. And it said, I sought myself and could not see. I sought my God, he eluded me. And then I sought my brother, and I found all 3. It is in the fellowship of the Spirit, as the book says, join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit. Thank you for sitting and listening.